Water has a temperature underground that most people never think about. On the surface, water follows the air, freezing when the temperature drops below 32 degrees, turning solid from the top down as winter deepens, becoming ice that can reach several feet thick in a cold enough winter. But underground, below the frost line, water maintains the steady temperature of the Earth itself, somewhere between 50 and 55 degrees, regardless of whether the surface is blazing in August or frozen in January. This water does not freeze because it cannot freeze, because the mass of the Earth surrounding it maintains a temperature that ice cannot exist in, because physics does not care about calendars or seasons. The settlers who came to Wyoming in the 1880s dug their wells the way their fathers and grandfathers had dug wells, straight down until they hit water, usually somewhere between 15 and 30 feet, depending on the water table. These depths were adequate for ordinary purposes. The water was cold enough to keep milk fresh in summer and clean enough to drink year-round. The wells required maintenance and occasional deepening, but they worked, and working was enough for most people. What most people did not understand was that these shallow wells were vulnerable. They tapped into water tables that sat close to the surface, water that had seeped down from rain and snowmelt, water that existed in the zone where the temperature of the ground was still influenced by the temperature of the air above. In a mild winter, this water stayed liquid. In a moderate winter, the top few feet might freeze, while the water below remained accessible. But in a severe winter, a winter cold enough and long enough to drive the frost line deep into the earth, these shallow wells could freeze solid from top to bottom, turning the water that communities depended on into columns of ice that no amount of chopping could convert back to liquid. Ezra Tannen understood this because he had seen it happen. In the winter of 1873, when Ezra was a young man working a homestead in Nebraska, the cold had come early and stayed late, driving frost deeper into the ground with each passing week. By February, every well in the settlement had frozen solid. The livestock began dying first, cattle and horses collapsing from dehydration while surrounded by snow. They could not melt fast enough to sustain themselves. The people followed, not dying of thirst exactly, but weakening from rationed water, from melted snow that took more fuel to produce than anyone could spare, from the simple mathematics of survival when a necessary resource becomes unavailable. 14 people died in that settlement before spring came. 14 people who had done everything right by conventional standards, who had dug their wells to proper depths, who had prepared for winter the way everyone prepared for winter. They died because the winter was not conventional, because the cold went deeper than anyone had planned for, because the wells that had always worked stopped working when they were needed most. Ezra never forgot. He carried that winter with him across 3 decades and half a dozen territories, always looking for water that could not freeze, always digging deeper than his neighbors said was necessary, always searching for the underground springs that bubbled up from depths where winter could not reach. He found one in Wyoming in 1885, on a patch of land that no one else wanted because the water table was too deep for ordinary wells, because the ground was rocky and difficult to work, because everything about the property said that making a living there would be harder than making a living somewhere else. Ezra bought the land for almost nothing. He moved Martha and their supplies to a cabin they built from local timber. And then he started digging. The spring he was looking for lay 60 feet below the surface. He knew it was there because he had spent 30 years learning to read the signs, the patterns of vegetation that indicated deep water, the temperature variations in the soil that suggested geothermal influence, the subtle clues that the earth provided to anyone patient enough to observe them. Other men called it dowsing or witchcraft or simple luck. Ezra called it paying attention. He dug through the summer of 1885 and into the fall. He dug through rock that blunted his picks and clay that sucked at his shovel. He built a wooden frame over the hole and rigged a pulley system to haul dirt and stone from depths where no light reached. He descended into the earth every morning and climbed out every evening, making progress measured in inches, pursuing water that no one else believed existed. Vernon Haskell rode out to watch the digging in September when the hole had reached 40 feet and showed no sign of stopping. Haskell owned the largest ranch in the territory, thousands of acres of grazing land served by wells that had never failed him, and he considered himself an expert on everything related to ranching in Wyoming. He sat on his horse at the edge of Ezra's excavation and looked down into the darkness with the expression of a man viewing something both amusing and pathetic. "Tannen," Haskell called down, "what exactly do you think you are doing?" Ezra paused in his digging, looked up at the circle of daylight 60 feet above, and considered his answer. "Digging," he said finally. "I can see that you are digging. What I cannot see is why. There is no water here. The water table is 30 feet down at most in this territory. You have dug twice that deep and found nothing. You are chasing a ghost." Ezra resumed digging. "The spring is deeper," he said. 60 feet, maybe 70. The water comes from below the frost line. It will not freeze when your wells turn to ice." Haskell laughed, the comfortable laugh of a man who has never been wrong about anything important. "My wells have never frozen. I have ranched this territory for 20 years, and my wells have never frozen. You are digging your own grave, Tannen, and calling it a well. When you finally admit defeat, I will buy this land from you for what you paid for it, and I will fill in your hole so that no one else falls into it." He rode away still laughing, and Ezra continued digging, because he had learned long ago that arguing with wealthy men accomplished nothing. The water would argue for him. The winter would argue for him. The physics of underground temperature would argue for him in ways that no words could match. What Ezra built next provided water for 200 people and 3,000 head of cattle. If you want to see how one man's obsession proved an entire territory wrong, subscribe to Wild West Retribution and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Ezra hit water on October 3rd, 1885, at a depth of 62 feet. The water did not seep in slowly the way water table water did. It bubbled up from below, pushed by pressure from somewhere deep in the earth, a natural spring that had been flowing for centuries before anyone dug down to find it. The water was warm compared to surface water, 54 degrees, and it carried a faint mineral taste that spoke of the rock it had traveled through to reach this point. He built the spring house over the following weeks, lining the shaft with fitted stone to prevent collapse, constructing a chamber at the bottom where the water collected before being drawn up, installing a hand pump that could lift water to the surface without requiring anyone to descend into the earth. He built a small stone structure over the wellhead, partly for protection and partly to capture the warmth that rose from below, warmth that would keep the mechanism functioning when the surface temperature dropped below zero. The winter of 1885 to 86 was mild. The shallow wells worked fine. The cattle drank from streams that never froze completely. Vernon Haskell told everyone who would listen that Tannen had wasted a year digging a hole that was unnecessary, that the spring would probably dry up by summer, that the whole project was evidence of a mind that had lost its grip on practical reality. The summer of 1886 came and went. The spring did not dry up. It flowed at the same steady rate it had flowed since October, cool and clear and constant, providing water that Ezra and Martha used for drinking, for cooking, for washing, for their small vegetable garden that produced better than anyone expected, because the water carried minerals that the soil needed. The winter of 1886 to 87 was not mild. The cold began in November, earlier than usual, dropping temperatures below zero before Thanksgiving. December brought colder still, with stretches of 20 and 30 below that persisted for days at a time. The snow piled deep, which was normal enough, but the cold beneath the snow was something else, something that drove frost into the ground inch by inch, foot by foot, deeper than anyone in the territory had seen it go. The first wells froze in late December. The shallow ones, 15 and 20 feet deep, turned to solid ice from top to bottom. The ranchers who owned them switched to deeper wells, 30-foot wells that should have been safe, wells that had never frozen in 20 years of Wyoming winters. By mid-January, the 30-foot wells were freezing too. Vernon Haskell's ranch had 6 wells, all of them between 25 and 35 feet deep, all of them adequate for 20 years of ranching, all of them slowly turning to ice as the frost line sank deeper with each passing week of relentless cold. His cattle numbered over 2,000 head, animals that needed water every day, animals that would begin dying within 72 hours if water became unavailable. He tried everything. He built fires at the wellheads, trying to thaw the ice. He organized crews to chip through the frozen columns, working in shifts around the clock. He melted snow in every container he could find, producing a fraction of what his herd needed at a cost in firewood that was rapidly depleting his reserves. Nothing worked. The ice was too thick, too deep, too persistent. The cold would not relent, and the wells would not thaw, and his cattle were beginning to die. Ezra Tannen's spring continued flowing. The steam that rose from his spring house was visible from a mile away on cold mornings, a plume of warmth ascending into the frozen air, evidence of water that existed in liquid form when every other water source in the territory had turned to ice. The trough that led from the spring house ran continuously, carrying water that maintained its 54-degree temperature, regardless of the 30 below zero air that surrounded it. His small herd of cattle drank freely. His horses stayed healthy. He and Martha had water for everything they needed while their neighbors were rationing snowmelt and watching their livestock weaken. The first rancher came on January 23rd, a man named Thomas Carver, whose 100 head of cattle were 3 days without water and beginning to collapse. He arrived at Ezra's door with hat in hand and desperation in his eyes, asking if perhaps he could bring his cattle to drink from the spring that everyone had said was unnecessary, the spring that everyone had said would never be needed. Ezra let him. He let Carver bring his 100 cattle to the trough and watch them drink with the desperate urgency of animals that had been dying of thirst surrounded by frozen water. He charged nothing for the water, asked nothing in return, simply let the cattle drink until they had their fill, and then watched Carver lead them back toward his own ranch with tears of relief freezing on his weathered cheeks. More came. Word spread through the territory with the speed that desperation carries. The news that Tannen's spring was flowing, that Tannen was letting people use it, that there was water available for those who needed it. Ranchers came with cattle. Farmers came with horses and mules. Families came with buckets and barrels, hauling water back to homes where the wells had frozen and the snow was not melting fast enough. Vernon Haskell was the last to come. He arrived on February 8th. 3 weeks after the first ranchers had begun using Ezra's spring, his fine clothes disheveled and his prosperous belly beginning to show the effects of reduced rations. His herd had lost over 300 head to dehydration. His ranch hands had begun leaving for places where water still flowed. His empire, built on 20 years of doing things the way they had always been done, was collapsing because the winter had not done what winters had always done. He found Ezra at the spring house, maintaining the pump mechanism that kept the water flowing smoothly. The trough was surrounded by cattle from a dozen different ranches, animals that had walked miles through snow to reach water that would keep them alive. The scene was everything Haskell had said would never happen, everything he had dismissed as impossible, everything he had laughed at when Ezra was digging his 62-foot hole. "Tannin," Haskell said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of the confidence that had characterized every word he had spoken for 20 years. "I need water. My cattle are dying. My wells are frozen solid. I have tried everything. Nothing works." Ezra looked at him, the man who had called his spring a ghost, the man who had said he was digging his own grave, the man who had promised to buy his land and fill in his hole when he finally admitted defeat. "I know," Ezra said. "I have been watching your cattle die from here. I have been wondering how long it would take you to swallow your pride and ask for help." Haskell's face reddened, but he said nothing. There was nothing to say. His pride had already cost him 300 cattle. It might cost him his entire ranch if the winter continued. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. "Bring your herd," Ezra said. "The spring has enough for everyone. It has been flowing for centuries. It will not run dry because a few thousand cattle need to drink." Haskell brought his herd. It took 3 days to move all the surviving cattle to Ezra's property, nearly 2,000 animals that joined the growing collection of livestock from across the territory. The spring flowed steadily throughout, the water level dropping slightly with the demand, but never approaching exhaustion. The 54-degree temperature maintaining liquid water, while the air above stayed 30 below. The winter lasted until late March. The frost line reached nearly 10 feet in some areas, deeper than anyone had measured in the territory's history, deep enough to freeze wells that had been considered immune to freezing. But the spring that Ezra had found at 62 feet continued flowing, tapped into water from depths that the frost could never reach, providing liquid when every other source had turned to ice. Over 200 people drew water from Ezra's spring during the winter of 1886 to 87. Over 3,000 head of cattle survived because of water that one man had spent a year digging to find. The losses across the territory were still severe. Hundreds of animals dead from dehydration, several families who had been too proud or too distant to reach the spring in time. But the losses would have been catastrophic without the water that bubbled up from 62 feet below the frozen surface. Losses that would have depopulated the territory and turned prosperous ranches into graveyards. The reckoning came in April, when the thaw had finally begun and people could gather without risking frostbite. They met at the general store in town, ranchers and farmers and families who had survived the winter on water from Ezra's spring. People who had mocked his digging and now owed their livelihoods to the hole he had refused to stop digging. Ezra did not attend. Martha went in his place, standing quietly at the back of the room while others spoke, listening to the acknowledgments and apologies and promises that the spring would be properly compensated for its service. She listened, and then she walked home to tell her husband what had been said. He was at the spring house when she arrived, checking the mechanism as he did every day, ensuring that the water continued flowing smoothly. The cattle were gone now, returned to ranches where the thaw was refilling the shallow wells. The spring flowed for Ezra and Martha alone, as steady as it had been during the crisis, as reliable as it would be for decades to come. Vernon Haskell came later that evening. He came alone, on foot rather than horseback, walking the miles from his ranch to Ezra's homestead, because something about the gesture seemed important. He found Ezra sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in colors that only appeared after particularly harsh winters, as if the world was apologizing for what it had done. "I owe you more than I can repay," Haskell said. He did not sit down. He stood in the yard like a man who understood he had not earned the right to be comfortable. "You saved my herd. You saved my ranch. You saved my life, because I am not sure I would have survived losing everything I spent 20 years building." Ezra looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "I did not save your herd for you. I saved it because cattle should not die of thirst when there is water available. I saved it because I watched 14 people die in Nebraska when I was young, and I swore I would never watch that happen again if I could prevent it. Your gratitude is unnecessary. Your apology is unnecessary. What happened this winter was not about you." Haskell absorbed this without protest. He had learned, over 3 months of watching his wells freeze and his cattle die, that the world did not arrange itself around his convenience or his expectations. The winter had taught him humility in a way that no human teacher ever could. "I understand," he said, "but I will pay for the water my cattle drank nonetheless. And I will tell everyone who asks that Ezra Tannen was right when I said he was wrong, that his spring saved the territory when conventional wisdom would have destroyed it." He left a bank draft on the porch railing and walked away into the evening. Ezra did not look at the amount until the next morning. It was enough to buy half the territory, if he had wanted to buy half the territory. He used it instead to deepen other wells across the region, to help neighbors find the underground water that would protect them from future winters, to spread the knowledge that had saved so many lives. Ezra Tannen lived on his Wyoming homestead for another 31 years, passing in the spring of 1918 at the age of 83. The spring that he found in 1885 still flows today, maintained now by the county as a historical site and emergency water source. The stone spring house he built still stands, weathered but solid, protecting the wellhead from the elements the way it has protected it for over a century. There is a brass plaque on the spring house wall installed by the Wyoming Historical Society in 1952, 67 years after Ezra began digging. It reads, "Tannen Spring, dug 1885 by Ezra Tannen. Depth, 62 feet. During the winter of 1886 to 87, this spring provided water for over 200 people and 3,000 head of cattle when all other water sources in the territory froze solid. The spring has never frozen and has never run dry. The settlers who called his digging obsessive, who said he was chasing a ghost, who laughed at a man spending a year pursuing water that nobody believed existed, they understood what those words meant by the time the winter was over. The spring had never frozen. The spring had never run dry. And everyone who had doubted Ezra Tannen had learned to trust the man who trusted the earth. If this story taught you something about finding water that winter cannot touch, subscribe to Wild West Retribution. We have more forgotten engineering that kept people alive when nothing else could. And tell me in the comments, What would you dig for if no one believed you would find it? 62 feet straight down. That was the difference between survival and catastrophe. That was the distance between ice and flowing water. That was the depth of one man's faith in what the earth could provide.